So for the final reading for the semester, I've asked you to read Cory Doctorow's book, or the first couple of chapters of Cory Doctorow's book, A Walk Away. I mean, it's sneaky. I'm hoping that at least some of you might be as excited enough by those first couple of chapters that you go ahead and finish off the book. Go ahead and buy a copy of it, which you can find fairly easily, and read it. Doctorow's an interesting guy and an interesting author. I was lucky enough to meet him he came to the ASU campus as part of our the CSI group, the Center for Science and the Imagination, which invites a number of science fiction authors, some of my favorites, to campus, and sadly, in many cases, never meet your heroes kind of a thing. They're not as interesting in person as their writing is, which is fine because their writing is great. But Doctorow actually really is kind of involved and thinks about these things, and was directly involved in some of the early social media stuff. So, he was a co-author of Boing Boing, kind of one of the most widely read blogs on the web. He was involved in Flickr. So, unlike some other folks, I mean, like I would say the one of the keystone cyberpunk novels is Neuromancer, which was famously written by William Gibson on a typewriter. He said, he thinks he did it so well because he really didn't know anything about the stuff he was writing about. So he was starting with a blank slate. But Doctorow does. I mean, he's kind of involved in some of these questions around cryptography and surveillance and knows about the tech underneath it. And so I think that makes him, for me at least, a much more interesting writer. And he seems to be extraordinarily prophetic in some of the things he writes. One of the thing that turned me on to him was a novella called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, about people who kind of, take over Disney World as a collective and keep it running well past its prime. So he in that book comes up with this concept of woofy, which is a reputational currency, which he suggests kind of ends up overtaking traditional currency, so that if you do favors for people, that earns you woofy or reputation in some sense. And it's silly, of course, but it's also kind of prophetic. Walk Away, I don't want to ruin it because I suspect that you may have read both chapters and you may not have. If you haven't, I don't want to spoil stuff because it is, unlike some of the other stuff we've read, very clearly fiction. But it does, it's right in the title, there's this idea that there is coexisting a world in which people have rejected the commercial and governmental controls that are common, that we would expect are kind of an extreme version of where we are right now. And they've rejected this and walked away from the expectations of what we could say kind of the expectations of bourgeois life, and join this emerging communist or socialist utopia or communist utopia, right? Which seems really ridiculous because this idea of rejectionism, sure, there have always been people who have rejected, there's been a long-term simplicity movement. There have been lots of people who've kind of moved towards homesteading over the last couple of decades. But this is like a tiny, tiny, weird fringe, right? And in Walk Away, the idea is that this fringe grows much larger and much more powerful. And I think in the second half of the book, it devolves a bit. I think this is true of all of I think he's not alone in this. I think he does great world building, which doesn't necessarily tie up as neatly as I'd like in terms of a novel. Some of my favorite science fiction authors are that way. I think Neil Stephenson's that way as well. He just does wonderful world building, and then you're like, is that the end? Can't we get someone to come in and workshop this end? Now, of course, I am not a best-selling science fiction author, and so it seems silly for me to critique that. But I think that's his weak point. That said, he does kind of draw out this idea of how is it that these people have walked away. And it seems really fanciful, but I am recording this at the tail end of 2020 when we have this issue of people not taking jobs, of, this question of non-full employment, often by choice, of people leaving not just poorly paid jobs. I mean, I think the clear indicator here is that, small restaurants, small bakeries, fast food can't find people that'll work for minimum wage or even well above minimum wage. And so I think that's the part that's the most visible. But the statistics show that people are walking away from careers and well-paid jobs as well. There seems to be this kind of they haven't called it this, but this large scale walk away. And they're aside, I mentioned this kind of going back, this idea of the simplicity movements and that sort of thing. There have always been there's been this weird space, right? Which isn't just, so you certainly have like the bohemian space, right? You have people who decide that they want to be poets or they want to be artists, and they understand that in the current culture, being a poet or an artist means that you are poor. And so they accept that, and they might get little jobs along the way. I've met people. I've met a philosopher who helped me move from one city to another. He was, he had his PhD in philosophy and worked on a moving crew for a moving company, packing and moving boxes. And he did that because it was something that he could do in short jets of time and get enough money and then disappear for a while. My sister is a not professional surfer. She's just a surfer. And so she's kind of chained together jobs that love her, where she can walk away for, months at a time and go to Bali or go to, New Zealand or wherever. I don't know where she is in the world. I think she's in Mexico right now, or in El Salvador. But she just kind of disappears for a while and does that. She has no desire to become wealthy. She makes enough money to kind of support herself in these places long enough to surf, and that's fine with her. And she's perfectly happy with that. So you have that you've always had that kind of bohemian edge. In her group are folks who are trustafarians as well. That is, who are wealthy enough to do that without having to worry about the money. And I will say that when I lived in Manhattan, there was this weird group, right? There was a book going back about 2 decades ago called Bobos in Paradise. This is kind of this idea of a bourgeois bohemian. And I think that group, people who are reasonably well off, but who are who still engage in that ideal of bohemianism to a certain extent. I think we've run into the idea of Burning Man being a kind of temporary piece of this, maybe. This idea of people that are in this weird space that's not bourgeois, that's not wealthy enough to just be kind of idle rich, but who make enough money that they can engage in different kinds of ways. Strangely, I think a lot of that, as I said, in Manhattan was kind of groups of programmers who lived in Brooklyn. And I don't know if this is just kind of the crowds that I was moving in and out of, but like there were folks who basically lived communally in apartments that were they were living as a group, but they were quite expensive, right? And they were making decent money because they were programmers, but they were working often in projects that were not, they weren't getting. They may have been paid as part of an arts organization or through a grant-funded project or something like that, right? So they weren't making the big bucks. They weren't working for Google, or maybe they were working for Google temporarily. Some of them were maybe doing startups, but they were doing, it's a weird space, this kind of entrepreneurial / social entrepreneurial space that's not like Elon Musk or I need my stock options, but I need to make enough money to live the way I'm living, but I'm going to iterate and build things because I like to build things. And so I don't know what that class is, but it feels like it's reflected in Walkaway. And I think that as we've seen some major shifting and dissatisfaction with the huge division between the wealthy and the not wealthy in the United States, this kind of wealth gap that just continues to accelerate at an extreme degree, I think we're seeing a growing group. And a lot of them are technologists. And so this idea of Walkaway is obviously kind of I think a fantasy from doctorow's perspective, but one that I think a lot of people could buy into. And so I think it tells us a little bit about that division. It's that Benkler car division, but literally people leaving to a different place in order to do that, or becoming part of a different social structure. Question becomes, is that something that could really happen? And if it does, how do those two, how can they coexist? And what does it look like if they coexist? And I'm hopeful, right, that there might be spaces like that. But I don't see them to a large extent right now. I think that instead of these being two separate paths, I think people do little things on one side or the other. That they they feel the freedom to when they feel the freedom to engage, they can make choices about whether that engagement is along the path that is the kind of commercial expected participation, kind of investing money, living off of your investments, this kind of traditional bourgeois engagement with economy, or whether it's going the other direction and saying, I'm going to build things and do stuff that makes me happy, and then just do enough to kind of keep myself able to do this other stuff. And so I think that people kind of pick their own out of pieces of this. You don't actually walk away. You don't have to walk away. You moonlight, right? So I think that there's a lot of people who keep a foot on both sides. But I think that as kind of something to read through and help to think about that division, I really like Doctorow's book. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. And this kind of rounds us out for both the week and the semester. And I hope that, I know from some of the interactions that I might not have, but I hope that you see that arc from the idea of a public kind of tracing its way through, this idea of network publics through to this question of participation in publics. And no matter what you do afterwards, I think that piece is essential. And I may kind of do a quick video to talk a little bit more about that. All right. Thanks very much.